Wrote yesterday afternoon and this morning and posted over at HartmannReport.com. The headline is "The Hidden Secret Behind the Arizona Ballot Counting." The subhead is "Republicans are channeling Joseph Stalin, who once suggested it doesn't matter who votes, what matters is who counts the votes." And of course, what I'm talking about is what's going on in Arizona right now. And apparently it's going to be happening soon in other states as well, where this private company that is run by some conspiracy nuts who have never audited an election before, are being brought in by hardcore Republican, right-wing Republicans, and given the ballots and asked to look them over and figure out if there was any fraud. And in Arizona, according to the only news network that is allowed inside the building is One American News, one of these far right. You can't even call it a news network; it's a propaganda operation, on behalf of the billionaire class. And they're saying, well, we're looking at some preliminary evidence, or words to the effect of looking at preliminary evidence of some hanky-panky here. There's something skeezy, some fraud. There's some history here, and you could say, oh, yeah, the Republicans, they're just trying to establish that, the Democrats are up to no good. The simple fact of the matter is, if you just grab some random Republican on the street and say, quick, tell me, how did Jack Kennedy win the 1960 election? 8 out of 10 of them, 4 out of 5 of them will say to you, Mayor Daley stole the election for him. Right? I mean, this is like revealed truth to Republicans. They all, right across the board. And I've been hearing this my whole entire life from Republicans. Mayor Daley stole the election for JFK in 1980 in Chicago. Well, it turned out that JFK beat Richard Nixon. He had 303 electoral votes, and Nixon had 219. So even if Kennedy had lost all of Illinois, forget Chicago, even if he'd lost the entire state, he still would have won the presidency. So it's BS on its face. But beyond that, the Republican Party started cranking this thing right after the election, before Jack Kennedy was inaugurated. They said, oh, Mayor Daley gave him the election in Chicago. And so they did an audit. And they found that, no, there were no bad votes. Everything was right. And so Kennedy gets sworn into office, and a few months later, the Republicans go at it again. Kennedy stole the election. Mayor Daley did it for him. And they did a second audit that the media observed. And sure enough, Kennedy won Illinois and Chicago. No surprise. But to this day, Republicans think Kennedy lost Chicago and therefore should not have become president, even though had he lost all of Illinois, he still would have become president. But they've got this thing in their heads. And there are some people who are saying, oh, that's what they're doing in Arizona right now. That's what they're trying to do. This isn't some part of some kind of big strategic long game. This is just sore loserdom. This is victimhood. This is something that the Republican Party, and frankly, there are Democrats, myself included, who have felt that there were some skeezy things going on with elections, like in 2000 when the Supreme Court basically handed the election to George W. Bush. I'm still thinking, we got robbed, of Al Gore being president. But nonetheless, let's just say that there are some people who think that right now what's going on with this recount in Arizona and soon to come to other states where it's not really a recount, there's no real press being allowed in, they're not following the rules of the state, et cetera. That what's going on is they're just trying to establish this narrative so that 60 years from now, just like 60 years, we're, 60 years on from the Kennedy election. And in fact, what is it, 80 years? Some incredible number of years. No, it must be like 60 years. And that 60 years from now, that Republicans will sit around and say, oh, yeah, that Joe Biden became president, but, he actually won the election in Arizona and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. And it was like Mayor Daley. But I don't think that's what's going on. Because the Republicans back in that time, Richard Nixon at first thought that there was some hanky-panky in the election. He was the one who was calling for the recount, which he got. But Richard Nixon never tried to pit Americans against each other. Richard Nixon didn't say, you know, people with guns need to get out in the streets. Richard Nixon didn't invite thousands of people to the Capitol building to try to storm the Capitol during the counting of the electoral count of the electoral ballots. Richard Nixon actually supported the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and school integration, as did Dwight Eisenhower, who was the last Republican president. Richard Nixon was his vice president. It was the official position of that policy and of both those politicians to support those things. The racists of that time were not the GOP. There were certainly a lot of racists in the GOP, but the outspoken racists, that was Jesse Helms, Strom Thurmond, and George Wallace. They were all Democrats. This was all pre-64, 65. So Richard Nixon, you know, yeah, he was venal, he was corrupt, he took bribes, he did shakedowns, he was an anti-Semite, he was a racist, but he at least had the common courtesy. He at least cared enough about his country that when he lost an election, he stepped down. And he said, okay, I lost the election. Jack, I wish you well. And then he came back, you know, 8 years later and won. Richard Nixon served his country. He volunteered for sea duty during World War II in the Pacific Theater, which could be a death sentence. Richard Nixon volunteered for that in uniform. Can you imagine Donald Trump or any member of the Trump family volunteering for military service? According to Trump, anybody who volunteers for military service is a sucker. What we are looking at now is nothing like the Kennedy-Nixon debate. What we are looking at right now is the Republican Party trying to invent fraud that they can use as justification for more and more draconian laws that change the way that we vote. And not just changing the way that we vote so that black people have to stay in line for 14 hours instead of just 10 hours. Or not just change the way that we vote so that you can't drop your ballot in a drop box, or you can't even get a ballot in the mail. You've got to show up in person. Not just that. But what they've already done in at least 2 states, in Georgia and I believe in Arizona or Idaho, and is on the, you know, is being proposed now in over a dozen Republican states, is that the Secretary of State and the election professionals who year after year, basically bureaucrats who work for the government who are not political people, and make sure that the count is accurate. And everybody trusts them because everybody knows this is just what they do for a living. And it's all transparent. That those people are taken out of the process of counting votes and are being replaced by folks like this right-wing company run by conspiracy nuts who are, you know, MAGA followers in Arizona. That, you know, as Georgia has done. The Secretary of State no longer certifies the election. It's now the legislature. And the legislature is controlled by Republicans. So they get to say, you know, we're just going to throw out those votes from Atlanta. We don't like those. Nothing to stop them from doing that. What we are looking at right now is democracy itself, our republic, being torn down and replaced by an authoritarian form of government that more closely resembles Hungary or Turkey or Russia. That's what's going on. Those are the stakes. And the one thing standing in the way of that is H.R. 1, the For the People Act, now Senate Bill 1, which has passed the House of Representatives, and the only thing that's stopping it from passing the Senate is the filibuster.